Why was she always the smallest one in the room, yet the one everyone silently feared? Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the Naval Academy's training field, her boots sinking slightly into the damp Maryland soil. The morning sun hadn't fully burned through the mist, leaving the parade ground veiled in a gray haze that shimmered like ghosts from her past. She adjusted her cap, her eyes tracing the formation of new cadets assembling before her. Rows of eager faces, crisp uniforms, nerves hidden behind forced confidence. Another class. Another batch of the future, bright-eyed, untested, and utterly unaware of what it truly meant to be a soldier. She had once been like them. Naive, idealistic, thinking medals equaled meaning, and valor could somehow erase pain. Her fingers brushed the small scar behind her right ear, a reminder of Kandahar, a reminder of how silence could save your life when screams couldn't. The wind carried faint laughter from the cadet line, male voices, young, arrogant. It didn't bother her. Not anymore. She'd faced worse taunts from the enemy, worse doubts from her own allies. But something in that laughter, a careless edge, made her look up. Cadet James Reynolds. Even his posture radiated entitlement. Son of an admiral, top marks. A legacy name whispered with pride in corridors lined with portraits of men who'd never bled on real soil. He was flanked by three others, Wilson, Tanner, and Briggs, each wearing the same smug expression that said, "We've already arrived." Sarah returned her gaze to her clipboard, steady, unflinching. She could feel their stares, the unspoken question that hovered like static in the humid air. A woman, a seal. Impossible. The whisper came anyway, sharp enough to cut through the quiet. That's our special instructor. Thought we were getting someone from Team 6, not a recruitment poster. The words landed like pebbles against steel. Small, insignificant, but noticed. She said nothing. Just a quiet breath through the nose, a shift of her jaw. Silence was her first weapon. People always filled silence with weakness. That mistake had gotten many men killed before. Colonel Mayor Tangastal, a legend in her own right, had handpicked Sarah for this assignment. They don't need another war story, she told her. They need a reminder that control is power, not rage, not size, not ego, control. Sarah had nodded, knowing exactly what that meant. Because once, years ago, she'd lost it, and it had almost cost her everything. The field fell still as Sarah stepped forward. She didn't shout. She never needed to. Her voice carried, low but commanding, the kind of tone that came from someone who'd given real orders under real fire. "I'm Lieutenant Mitchell," she began. "For the next 8 weeks, I'll be teaching you advanced close-quarters combat and tactical decision-making." A pause, her gaze scanned the line. "If you have questions about my qualifications, save them. By the end of today, you won't have any." That earned her silence. The good kind, not obedience but curiosity. That was step 1. Reynolds smirked, arms folded. He didn't look convinced. Neither did his friends. But Sarah didn't need belief. She needed focus. She gestured toward the tables stacked with training weapons. "Your weapon," she said, "is your lifeline, but it's also your weakness. You'll learn how to defend it and how to take it from someone who's careless enough to lose it." The cadets moved, some eager, some wary. Sarah watched their movements, how they carried themselves, how they held the weapons. In combat, posture told you everything. She spotted Reynolds again, whispering to his friends. She caught fragments. "My father says these diversity picks are killing combat standards." Still calm, still steady. The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite amusement, not quite disdain. She had been told the same thing once before proving them wrong. Before earning her trident in the freezing waters of Coronado while men twice her size dropped out. Before dragging a wounded teammate 5 miles under fire because no one else could move him. Respect wasn't given. It was taken silently, cleanly through action. And today, she intended to take it. The first half of the day was drills. Basic disarmament. Footwork. Situational awareness. Sarah moved among the cadets, adjusting stances, offering calm corrections. "Center of gravity," she murmured to one. "Don't telegraph your motion." Her tone was patient but firm. When she passed Reynolds's group, their laughter died mid-sentence. He tried to mask it with a cough. She ignored it for now. Every class had one. The tester, the one who needed to push limits to measure their power against hers. She didn't hate them for it. In a strange way, she respected it. It was exactly that type, cocky, impulsive, unbroken, who, once humbled, made the best soldiers. But they always needed a lesson first. As the sun climbed higher, the scent of sweat and dust thickened the air. Sarah called for the final drill. "Hostage scenario," she announced. "Two-person teams. One attacker, one defender. I'll call switch every 2 minutes." The cadets scattered, pairing off, gripping their training weapons, modified to deliver harmless electric shocks, enough to remind them what losing meant. Sarah's eyes lingered on Reynolds. He paired with Wilson, of course, the golden duo, confident, relaxed, careless. "Let's see if they learn," she muttered. She walked the line, her boots crunching against gravel, correcting grips, lowering barrels. And then a voice. "Lieutenant," Reynolds, loud enough for half the field to hear. "Wilson and I could use a demonstration. We're having trouble visualizing proper technique." It wasn't a request, it was bait. Sarah turned. The air seemed to shift, cadets nearby pausing mid-motion. She knew exactly what this was, a challenge, a test. She met his gaze, her face unreadable. "Of course, Cadet Reynolds," she said softly. "I'll play the defender." He smiled. She recognized that smile. She'd seen it before on the faces of enemy captors who underestimated her. The kind of smile that said, "You don't scare me." Good, she didn't need to. She stepped into position. "Whenever you're ready." Reynolds hesitated, just long enough for her instincts to stir. Something wasn't right. Then movement. A nod between the four of them. Reynolds, Wilson, Tanner, Briggs. And suddenly, they surrounded her. The metallic click of training weapons being readied. 4 barrels aimed directly at her. One, Reynolds's, pressed cold against her temple. Gasps rippled through the line of cadets. The kind of silence that follows disbelief. Sarah didn't move, didn't blink. Her voice, when it came, was calm as still water. "Interesting scenario modification," she said quietly. 4 against 1, unarmed target. Reynolds smirked. "Let's make this realistic, Lieutenant." He wanted an audience. He had one. From the administration building, Colonel Tangestal's silhouette appeared in the window. Watching, assessing, no interference, not yet. Sarah breathed once, slow and steady. Every nerve in her body shifted from instruction to survival, not fear, calculation. She spoke evenly. "Your first mistake," she said, "was assuming I'm unarmed." The words were still in the air when she moved. Her right hand shot up, slapping Reynolds's weapon aside while twisting his wrist in a precise, brutal arc. The gun hit the dirt. His body followed, knees collapsing. Before his friends even processed it, she pivoted, elbow striking Wilson in the sternum, using his momentum to hurl him backward into Tanner. Both went down in a tangle of limbs. Briggs froze, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. "Drop it," she ordered, voice like steel. He hesitated. She fired Reynolds's fallen weapon at his hand, a crackle of energy and a sharp yelp as the shock jolted him. His gun fell, clattering. Silence again. 5 seconds, that's all it had taken. When the echoes faded, 3 cadets lay stunned on the ground, one trembling, and Sarah stood motionless in the center of the chaos. Her breathing was slow, controlled. Her tone never changed. "Second mistake," she continued, as if delivering a lecture, "was believing numbers guarantee victory." She turned to Reynolds, still on the ground, clutching his wrist, his expression shifting from arrogance to something else. Something raw, fear and respect. "During my second tour," she said softly, I was separated from my unit near Kandahar. 6 men thought I was an easy target. Her gaze locked on his. None of them reported back to their commander. Nobody dared speak. The air itself felt heavy with the realization of what they'd just witnessed. Then from the loudspeaker, Colonel Tangistal's voice, calm, controlled. "Lieutenant Mitchell, my office. Bring Cadet Reynolds and his friends." The silence broke. Sarah holstered the weapon, extended a hand toward Reynolds. He hesitated, then took it. His grip trembled. The same hand that had held a gun to her head now sought balance. As she led them toward the administration building, the rest of the cadets stood at attention, not by command, but by instinct. They had seen something rare. Not anger, not revenge. Control. Sarah leaned toward Reynolds as they walked. Her voice was quiet, almost kind. "Third mistake," she murmured, "was not researching your opponent. I trained under Lieutenant Audie Murphy's grandson. He taught me that size and gender mean nothing in combat, only skill and will." The words lingered between them like smoke as they disappeared into the building. The field remained silent, broken only by the whisper of wind through flags, and the faint hum of respect that followed her wherever she went. Inside, the walls seemed to absorb the weight of what had just transpired. Reynolds and his friends stood in silence, awaiting their fate, but Sarah wasn't thinking about punishment. Not yet. She was thinking about something else entirely, the memory of a day, long ago, when she had stood in their place, when her arrogance had almost cost a life, when someone had given her a second chance instead of an ending. And as the door to Colonel Tangistal's office closed behind them, Sarah knew the real lesson hadn't even begun yet. Why was the air always colder in the colonel's office? Even after years of service, the moment Sarah stepped through that doorway, she felt it, the invisible chill of command, of judgment, of being measured. The blinds were half drawn, slicing thin beams of light across the polished floor. 4 cadets stood at attention, shoulders tight, eyes fixed straight ahead, while the colonel reviewed her notes behind the desk. The sound of pen against paper filled the silence, deliberate and slow, like the ticking of a metronome counting down their future. Colonel Mayor Tangistal finally looked up. Her expression was unreadable, neither anger nor disappointment, just the steady calm of a woman who'd seen everything and no longer needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. "Lieutenant," she said softly, gesturing to Sarah, "your report." Sarah handed her a clipboard. "Confirmed insubordination, ma'am. No injuries sustained. Corrective action pending." Tangistal nodded once, then let her gaze fall on the cadets. "At ease," she said, though her tone carried no warmth. The 4 relaxed slightly, only slightly. Reynolds's jaw tightened. His wrist still bore the faint mark of Sarah's disarm. Wilson's face was pale, his breath shallow. They'd faced simulated ambushes all day, but this was real fear. The colonel leaned back in her chair. "In my 25 years of service," she began, "I've seen arrogance before. I've seen overconfidence, carelessness, the kind of ego that gets people killed. But I have never," her voice sharpened, "never seen cadets point a weapon, training or not, at a superior officer." Her words hung heavy in the air. Reynolds flinched but kept silent. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. "Cadet Reynolds," Tangistal said, "you understand what that means, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "In combat it's treason. In training," she paused, letting the weight of it drop, "grounds for immediate dismissal." No one breathed. Briggs's throat bobbed. Tanner's fingers twitched by his sides. Sarah watched quietly, her face unreadable. Inside, she felt something more complicated, not triumph, not satisfaction, just a kind of heavy sadness. She'd seen this look before in young men who thought they were untouchable until the moment they realized they were. Tangistal exhaled slowly, her eyes softening, almost imperceptibly. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she said, "has requested to handle your discipline personally." That made all 4 heads snap toward Sarah. She stepped forward. calm, steady. "Tomorrow, 0500, she said. "You'll report to the obstacle course. You'll train with me for 2 weeks before your regular classes begin." Her tone carried no anger, only certainty. "You'll learn what it means to be a warrior, not a soldier who hides behind a weapon." Reynolds finally broke his gaze forward. His voice wavered. "Permission to speak, ma'am." "Granted." "Why?" He swallowed hard. "We disrespected you, threatened you. You could have ended our careers. Why give us another chance?" Sarah studied him for a long moment. Behind his question was something raw, not defiance anymore, but shame. And beneath that, a spark she recognized, the beginning of humility. "Because someone gave me one," she said quietly. Her words hung there, gentle but weighted with memory. Tangastal's eyes flickered toward her, curious. Sarah didn't elaborate, not yet. Instead, she added, "You'll be on the field at dawn. Don't be late." She turned to leave, the cadets saluting stiffly behind her. As the door shut, the sound echoed through the corridor like the closing of a cell. Outside, the hallway was empty. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the sterile floor tiles. Sarah walked slowly, each step deliberate. Her reflection followed her in the glass, calm on the surface, storm beneath. She didn't enjoy discipline, never had. But discipline was mercy. Someone had once taught her that. The next morning came early, darker than most. Cold air bit at the lungs. The obstacle course glistened with dew, ropes stiff, sand damp. The 4 cadets stood waiting, bleary-eyed, shivering in their training fatigues. No smugness now, no laughter, just silence. Sarah arrived without ceremony. She wore the same uniform as they did, simple, unmarked. A quiet statement, "We suffer together." 5 miles, she said. "No talking, just movement, follow me." And then she started running. The first mile broke Wilson. By the third, Tanner stumbled. By the fifth, Reynolds's breath came ragged, but he refused to fall behind. Sarah ran at a steady, punishing pace, not sprinting, not lagging, just constant, unrelenting. Her breathing didn't change. Her posture didn't falter. Every step was a message: control, endurance, resolve. When they returned, the sun was rising, the first light cutting through the horizon, painting the world in gold and fatigue. The cadets collapsed against the fence, gulping air. Sarah stood before them, barely sweating. "Combat," she said between breaths, "isn't about killing. It's about outlasting, outthinking, and outcontrolling." She looked directly at Reynolds. "And control starts with humility." They trained in silence after that, obstacle after obstacle, crawling through mud, scaling walls, carrying sandbags until their arms shook, every motion deliberate, every word from her brief, surgical. No yelling, no humiliation, just precision and presence. By the third day, they had stopped looking at her as an enemy. By the fifth, they started listening. By the seventh, they followed her lead without hesitation. It wasn't submission, it was respect earned the hard way. But for Sarah, each morning began the same way, with that one thought: because someone gave me a second chance. The memory came back one evening after training, uninvited. It was years ago, her own cadet days. She'd been brash, impatient, desperate to prove she could survive what the others couldn't. During a night exercise, she disobeyed a direct order, thinking she knew better. The result, 2 teammates injured. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Susan Annity, could have had her expelled. Instead, she'd said something that stayed etched in Sarah's mind forever. "You don't build warriors by breaking them, Mitchell. You build them by teaching them what almost breaking feels like." That night, Sarah had cleaned the armory alone until dawn. No punishment harsher than silence. No lesson deeper than mercy. And now, years later, standing on that same kind of soil, she found herself echoing that mercy, not out of forgiveness, but understanding. That's what Tangastal had seen in her, not just skill, but restraint. On the 10th day, Sarah noticed something had shifted. Reynolds moved differently. No arrogance in his stance now, just focus. He followed orders cleanly, helped Wilson over the wall without prompting, stayed late to practice technique. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was with sincerity. During a break, he approached her quietly. "Lieutenant," he said, voice steady but soft, "you ever regret not walking away from all this?" Sarah looked up from where she was checking the training logs. His eyes were earnest, no longer the cocky boy from the first day. She considered the question carefully. "Every soldier regrets something," she said, "but walking away isn't one of them." He nodded, "Just wondering what keeps you here." She smiled faintly. "People like you, Cadet Reynolds." He looked confused. "Like me. The ones who think they already know who they are, until they realize they don't." A pause. "Those are the ones worth teaching." He didn't reply, but something softened in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. Sarah didn't need him to say thank you. Actions spoke louder, and in the days that followed, his actions said everything. He became quieter, steadier, sharper. Tanner and Briggs followed suit. Even Wilson, once the loudest, now listened more than he spoke. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, real, the kind that happens when pride gives way to purpose. 2 weeks later, Colonel Tangestal visited the field. She stood with arms crossed, watching as Sarah guided the cadets through their final drills. Reynolds led the formation, every motion clean, precise. Not perfect, but purposeful. When it ended, Tangestal turned to Sarah. "You turned 4 problems into 4 assets," she said quietly. "You always had a knack for that." Sarah shrugged lightly. "They just needed to see that strength doesn't have to shout." The colonel smiled faintly. "You remind me why I still believe in this place." Sarah's gaze drifted toward Reynolds. He was helping Wilson unstrap his gear, joking quietly, the tension of the first day gone. "They'll make good soldiers," she said softly, "maybe even better leaders." "Because of you," Tangestal added. Sarah didn't respond. Compliments always felt heavier than criticism. She wasn't looking for praise, just progress. As the cadets saluted and dismissed, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the field. Sarah stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air, feeling something she rarely allowed herself: peace. That night, she sat alone in her quarters. The letter from Lieutenant Anity still lived in her drawer, creased from years of unfolding. She opened it again, reading the familiar lines. "There will come a day when you'll face someone who reminds you of yourself. When that happens, don't destroy them, teach them." Sarah traced the words with her thumb, then closed her eyes. She realized that day had come and passed. And maybe, just maybe, she had done exactly what Anity once did for her. Outside, the Naval Academy grounds were silent. The lights from the dorms glimmered in the distance, and the faint rhythm of footsteps echoed on the training track. The world kept moving. Cadets kept learning. And somewhere among them, 4 young men carried lessons that would follow them long after graduation. Sarah leaned back, whispering to herself, half prayer, half promise. Sometimes, the hardest thing isn't fighting an enemy. It's forgiving the reflection of your old self standing right in front of you. She turned off the lamp. The room fell dark. But inside her, a quiet, steady light remained. Why do goodbyes always feel heavier when you've changed the people you're saying them to? 6 months had passed since that cold morning when 4 cadets had stood before her with fear in their eyes. The seasons had shifted, Maryland's fields now bathed in sunlight instead of frost, but some things lingered. The echoes of boots in formation, the smell of gun oil and earth, the sound of young voices slowly learning the rhythm of discipline and respect. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly among the instructors during the Naval Academy graduation ceremony. Her uniform, pressed and immaculate, carried the faint scent of sea salt from that morning's breeze. Around her, families gathered in proud clusters, flags waving, medals glinting under the sunlight. The brass band played softly, a melody of triumph, but also of transition. The cadets marched in precise unison across the stage. When they saluted, Sarah could see it, the difference. 6 months ago, their shoulders had carried arrogance. Now they carried purpose. Then came the voice over the loudspeaker. Cadet James Reynolds, recipient of honors in leadership and tactical excellence, will deliver the graduation address. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah's hands folded calmly on her lap, but her pulse gave a subtle, unbidden thrum. She hadn't seen him since their final debrief, hadn't spoken more than a few words since that last dawn run. She preferred it that way. Some lessons, she believed, didn't need to be revisited. They just needed to live on in silence. Reynolds approached the podium, his posture unmistakably changed. There was a steadiness now, a quiet confidence replacing the polished arrogance that once defined him. The sun caught on his insignia as he looked out at the sea of faces, cadets, instructors, parents, generals. His eyes swept the crowd, and for just a fraction of a second they found her. Sarah gave no nod, no smile, just a still presence, the kind that said, "I'm here. You made it." Reynolds took a slow breath, the microphone catching the faint quiver in his voice before it steadied. "When we arrived here," he began, "we thought we understood courage." He paused, letting the words breathe. "We thought courage meant strength, fearlessness, power." He looked down for a moment, his reflection shimmering on the polished wood. "But we were wrong." The crowd leaned in. Sarah did too, though she didn't move an inch. "True courage," Reynolds continued, "isn't loud. It isn't about dominating others or proving yourself right. Sometimes it's about standing still, even when someone has a gun to your head, and teaching them what control looks like." A murmur rippled through the rows. Tangestal, sitting beside Sarah, glanced sideways, eyes soft with recognition. Sarah's own breath caught briefly, but she said nothing. Reynolds went on, voice growing steadier. "Our instructor, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, showed us that courage is about restraint. That real strength doesn't humiliate, it transforms. That leadership isn't about punishment but redemption." He hesitated, and then smiled faintly, the kind of smile that only forms when truth outweighs pride. "She taught us that sometimes the hardest thing to do in the face of disrespect isn't retaliation. It's forgiveness." Silence. No applause, not yet. The audience just absorbed it. And in that stillness, Sarah felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not pride, something deeper, a kind of peace that came from knowing she hadn't just taught soldiers, she'd altered trajectories. Reynolds looked down again, exhaled, then concluded quietly. "On behalf of my class, thank you, Lieutenant. You didn't just make us stronger, you made us better." The applause came then, soft at first, then rising into a thunder that shook the air. But Sarah didn't join in. She sat still, eyes lowered, heart beating in quiet sync with the rhythm of gratitude that wasn't hers to claim. Because this wasn't about her. It was about what she'd passed forward, a lesson that had outlived the moment it was taught. After the ceremony, she stood under a lone oak near the edge of the parade ground, watching the crowd disperse. Families reunited, laughter echoing across the field. Cameras flashed, medals gleamed. A chapter closing for them, another opening somewhere far from here. Reynolds approached from behind, his steps hesitant on the gravel. She turned slightly, enough to acknowledge him without breaking the fragile silence between them. "Ma'am," he said softly. "Cadet Reynolds," she replied, still formal, though her tone carried warmth. He shook his head. "Ensign now." That earned him the faintest hint of a smile. "Congratulations." He shifted awkwardly, glancing toward the other instructors, then back at her. His parents stood not far behind his father, a stern-faced admiral, his mother with tearful eyes. They waited respectfully at a distance. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally, "for not giving up on me." Sarah studied him for a moment. His uniform was spotless, but his expression was human, tired, humble, sincere. The kind of face only real failure and redemption could shape. "You did the work," she said simply. "I just pointed you toward it." He shook his head slightly. "No, ma'am, you did more than that. You showed me what it means to lead." His father approached then, extending a hand to Sarah. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, his voice formal but respectful, "I've read your file. 2 Purple Hearts, 3 tour, first female SEAL instructor in Academy history." He hesitated, a rare flicker of humility. "My son's lucky to have learned from you." Sarah accepted his handshake. "He earned his own luck, sir." The Admiral nodded once firm. His wife smiled through tears. "You saved our son from himself," she whispered. Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She just gave a gentle nod. "He saved himself," she murmured. "He just needed a mirror." Reynolds's mother clasped his shoulder, proud and trembling. Then, as families began drifting away, Sarah turned back toward the field. The sun was sinking, the sky glowing with that deep, burnt orange that always reminded her of the desert, of another life, another version of herself. Colonel Tangestal joined her quietly. "Your program been approved," the colonel said, watching the graduates disperse. "Full implementation next semester. The Joint Chiefs are impressed." Sarah's eyes followed the last of her students fading into the distance. "It's not about impressing them," she said softly. "It's about making sure the next ones don't forget why they're here." Tangestal smiled. "You're the first instructor they've talked about like this in years. You gave them something no textbook can." Sarah glanced sideways. "What's that?" Tangestal met her gaze. "A conscience." The words lingered like a quiet benediction. Later that evening, the academy grounds fell silent again. The celebration had ended, the flags now motionless in the still air. Sarah sat alone on the bleachers, her cap resting beside her, her posture relaxed for the first time in months. The floodlights buzzed softly, painting her in white gold. She closed her eyes, listening to the echoes of laughter that still seemed to float through the night air. She thought of Reynolds's speech, of his words about control, forgiveness, transformation. He'd learned the lesson. He passed the test. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt the faint tug of pride she rarely allowed herself to feel. But beneath it was something else, a whisper of longing, a question that had lived quietly inside her since her last mission. Had she changed too much to go back to the fight? Or had the fight already changed her beyond recognition? She didn't know. All she knew was that teaching had brought a kind of peace she hadn't felt in years. Yet peace, for people like her, was always temporary. It came like the tide and always left with the next call of duty. As she rose to leave, her phone buzzed against the metal bench. A message. Classified origin, NAVSBCWARHQ. Subject line, request. Instructor evaluation overseas program, Kabul field deployment temporary assignment. Her hand hesitated on the screen. Afghanistan again. She looked out at the empty field, the same soil that had seen arrogance turn into respect, fear into focus. A soft breeze stirred the flags. Maybe the past wasn't done with her yet. She pocketed the phone, whispering to the night. Maybe it's time to see if I still remember who I was. The next morning, she stood on the training field one last time. The new class of cadets assembled before her, younger, fresher, unaware of the story that had unfolded on this same ground months earlier. Somewhere among them she saw flickers the same arrogance, the same fear, the same potential, and she smiled quietly. The cycle continued. Tangestal approached, holding a folder. "Your flight leaves in 48 hours, she said. "Temporary posting, but I have a feeling it won't stay that way." Sarah smirked lightly. "They never do." The colonel extended her hand. "You've done good work here, Mitchell." Sarah shook it firmly. "They did the hard part." Tangestal's expression softened. "Maybe, but someone had to show them how." As the colonel walked away, Sarah turned back to the field. The cadets were still lined up, waiting for instruction. She took one last long look at the ropes, the sand pits, the shadows, every scar on the ground a memory of growth. Then she exhaled, deep calm final. She wouldn't say goodbye. The field would remember her long after she was gone. When she finally walked away, her footsteps faded into the morning wind. And behind her, the faint echo of her command voice, steady, strong, controlled, carried across the field like a ghost. Discipline isn't punishment, it's purpose. That night before leaving base, Sarah stood by her locker, tucking away a framed letter. The one that Reynolds had written, the one she hadn't shown anyone. She read it one last time before sliding it carefully into her rucksack. You could have ended my career when I pointed that gun at your head. Instead, you showed me what it truly means to be a warrior. Some save lives by taking others. You save lives by transforming them. She smiled faintly, eyes stinging just enough to remind her she was still human. She zipped the bag, slung it over her shoulder and turned out the light. The next chapter was waiting. And as she walked toward it, the moral she'd lived by her whole life whispered softly in her mind, like a voice carried on the sea wind. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. How do you return to the place that once took everything from you, and still call it duty? The transport plane shuddered as it cut through the thin Afghan air, its engines roaring against the mountains. Sarah sat strapped into her seat, eyes fixed on the desert horizon through the small, scratched window. The landscape stretched endlessly, scorched earth and jagged stone. It was the same country she'd once bled in, but it didn't feel like the same world. Back then, she'd been a warrior. Now she wasn't sure what she was. The young lieutenant across from her glanced up nervously from his gear. "First time back, ma'am?" he asked. Sarah gave a faint smile, something like that. He nodded awkwardly, sensing there was more behind her answer but knowing better than to ask. That was good. She didn't want to talk. There were some silences that didn't need filling, especially not with strangers who hadn't yet learned what the silence was for. When the wheels hit the dirt runway at Bagram Airfield, the sound jolted through her chest like a heartbeat she'd tried to forget. Dust clouded the air as the rear hatch dropped open, flooding the cabin with the scent of jet fuel and sunburned sand. Heat struck like a physical force. Sarah shouldered her pack and stepped down the ramp, boots crunching against ground she once swore she'd never walk on again. A waiting officer saluted sharply. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, welcome back, ma'am." "Lieutenant will do," she corrected. He nodded. "We've been expecting you. Colonel Darnell, waiting for debrief in the operations tent. He requested you personally." Of course he did. Darnell. She hadn't heard that name in years. Once her commanding officer in the field, later one of the few who'd vouched for her return to stateside duty. A man with steel in his spine and secrets in his eyes. As she walked toward the base, the air filled with familiar sounds, rotor blades thudding overhead, voices shouting orders, the metallic rhythm of maintenance crews working through the heat. But beneath it all was the same uneasy undertone, the quiet hum of exhaustion that only people living too close to war ever carried. Colonel Darnell looked older when she entered the command tent. His hair was more gray than black now, his posture a little less rigid, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, cautious, hadn't changed. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, standing, "back in the sandbox, never thought I'd see that again." She gave a polite nod. "You requested me, sir." He motioned for her to sit. "I did. We've got a situation in the southern provinces. A joint Afghan-US base has gone dark. No confirmed hostiles, but communications have been down for 72 hours. Intel suggests possible infiltration or internal breakdown." Sarah crossed her arms. "And you're sending an advisory team." "Not just advisory," he said. "You'll lead it." Her brow lifted. "You said temporary assignment." He smiled faintly. "Everything's temporary until it is." That was Darnell's way, always half-truths and hidden motives. but she knew better than to argue. "Who's on my team?" He handed her a dossier. She flipped it open, 4 names, 4 photos. One of them made her pause. "Ensign James Reynolds." She blinked. "He's here." "Just arrived last week," Darnell said. "Volunteered, actually. Said he wanted field experience under your command." Sarah exhaled slowly, the corner of her mouth twitching in something between disbelief and reluctant pride. "He's persistent." "He's changed," Darnell said. "Speaks highly of you, told me you taught him everything he knows." Sarah closed the file. "Then I guess we'll see what he remembers." The mission briefing came at dusk, the air cooling just enough to make the desert tolerable. The small tent was dimly lit, maps spread across the table, satellite feeds flickering on the monitors. Reynolds entered last, taller now, leaner, his expression composed but unmistakably nervous. He saluted crisply. "Permission to join, ma'am." "Granted," Sarah said without looking up. When she did glance at him, she caught something in his eyes, that same spark of recognition, of history unspoken. They hadn't seen each other since graduation. He'd cut his hair shorter, carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone who'd finally found his footing. But there was something else, too, a tension that told her he understood what this mission could mean. She pointed to the map. "Base Echo 12, coordinates 33 north, 67 east, population 52. Last communication was a supply request 3 days ago. No distress call. We approach silent, assess, extract survivors if necessary. Questions?" Reynolds hesitated. "Possible enemy contact." Sarah looked up. "Always assume yes." No one spoke after that. They flew out before dawn, a single black hawk cutting through the early light. The landscape below stretched like a canvas of dust and shadow. Sarah sat by the open door, headset crackling faintly in her ear, eyes scanning the endless horizon. Reynolds sat across from her, checking his gear in silence. The others, 2 Marines and a medic, kept to themselves. Halfway through the flight, the pilot's voice came over comms. "Approaching Echo 12, no thermal activity, looks abandoned." Sarah frowned. "Run another pass." They circled once more. Still nothing, no movement, no signal, no visible damage, just silence. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust. Sarah disembarked first, rifle low, scanning the perimeter. The base looked intact, too intact. Gates open, vehicles parked, but no people. She motioned to the others. "Fan out, stay alert." They moved carefully through the compound, barracks, command post, comms tent. Everything was in place but eerily still. Half-eaten meals on tables, lights flickering, a radio playing static. Reynolds approached her quietly. "This doesn't feel right." "It isn't," Sarah said. "It's too clean." Then from the far side of the compound came a sound, a faint metallic clang. Instinct took over. Sarah raised her weapon, signaling for cover. They advanced slowly toward the sound. A shadow moved inside the storage hangar. "Identify yourself," she called out. No response. She stepped inside, slow, controlled, weapon steady. The smell hit first, sweat, oil, and something metallic. Then she saw him. A young Afghan soldier crouched near the generator, trembling, eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," Sarah said gently. "We're U.S. forces. What happened here?" He stammered in broken English. "They came at night, not Taliban, not soldiers." Sarah frowned. "Then who?" He shook his head violently. "No faces, only light, then dark." Before she could press further, the medic called from outside. "Ma'am, you need to see this." They ran to the command tent. Inside, on the main table, lay the last entry from the base log, a handwritten note, smeared and half-torn. "They're inside already. Don't trust comms. Someone opened the gate." Reynolds looked up. Internal betrayal. Sarah's jaw tightened. Or infiltration. The radio crackled suddenly to life, a voice low and distorted. "Mitchell, is that you?" Sarah froze. That voice, she knew it too well. She turned slowly toward the speaker. "Who is this?" The voice laughed softly. "Didn't think you'd come back." Reynolds glanced at her, confused. "Ma'am." She didn't answer. The world seemed to narrow to the sound of that voice, threading through static like a ghost. "You left me there, Sarah." Her blood ran cold. She stepped closer to the radio. "Identify yourself." "Oh, you remember. Kandahar, Compound 6. You took the knife, I took the bullet, but only one of us was evacuated." Reynolds looked at her in disbelief. "Someone survived that op." Sarah's throat tightened. "No one did, we cleared the field." "Not everyone," the voice hissed. "You saved the intel officer, you left your partner." The radio went silent. Sarah stood still, the words echoing in her skull like a ricochet. She hadn't heard that voice in years, not since the operation that had ended her combat career. The extraction gone wrong. The explosion. The chaos. Her teammate David Kane, presumed dead. Now the impossible, a voice that sounded exactly like his. Reynolds stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am, what was that?" Sarah's expression hardened. "We're leaving." "But that's an order." They withdrew immediately, setting up perimeter surveillance before dusk. The silence of the desert pressed down like a physical weight. Reynolds watched her from across the firelight that night, the flickering glow catching the lines in her face that hadn't been there before. He finally asked, voice low, "That voice, you knew him?" Sarah's gaze stayed fixed on the dark horizon. "I buried him, or thought I did." He didn't press further. The wind carried sand across the camp, whispering through the night. Somewhere out there in the endless desert, a ghost had spoken, and now it waited. Sarah lay awake long after the others slept. Every sound of the wind became a whisper from the past. Every flicker of flame, a reminder of what she'd lost. And for the first time in years, she felt it again, that old, cold fear that discipline couldn't quite silence. Because this wasn't just a mission anymore. It was unfinished business. What do you do when the dead start talking to you again? The dawn came quietly, too quietly. The desert had a way of swallowing sound, of making even wind feel like a secret. Sarah sat alone outside the temporary command tent, her rifle resting across her knees. The sky was painted in the soft pink of false peace. Inside the camp, the others were just beginning to stir, Reynolds checking the comms array, the medic boiling water, the Marines taking shifts on watch. But Sarah hadn't slept. Not after that voice. She could still hear it, the static, the words, the accusation. "You left me there, Sarah." Every syllable had weight. Every breath carried years of guilt she thought she'd buried beneath training manuals and commendations. The flap of the tent opened behind her. Reynolds stepped out, his face still shadowed by exhaustion. "Morning, ma'am," he said quietly. "You didn't sleep." Sarah didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, a line of pale fire stretching over the dunes. "Neither did you," she said finally. He hesitated. "That voice last night, you sure it wasn't interference?" Her jaw flexed. "Voices don't come with memories attached, Reynolds." He frowned. "Who was he?" Sarah looked down at her hands. The skin on her knuckles was rough, the faint scar on her right palm almost invisible now, but she could still feel the knife that had caused it, and the man who'd handed it to her all those years ago. "Kane," she said softly. "Lieutenant David Kane. We served together. Kandahar 2014. Extraction op gone sideways." Reynolds nodded slowly. "The one you mentioned, where you pulled out an intel officer." "Yeah," she said, her voice tightening, "and left him behind." He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Sarah stood. "We move out in 15. I want the perimeter expanded 2 clicks. Whatever's out there, I want eyes on it." Reynolds nodded, but as he turned to go, she stopped him. "And Reynolds," she added quietly, "not a word to the colonel yet, until we know what we're dealing with." "Yes, ma'am." He disappeared into the tent, and Sarah was left alone again with the silence. The desert didn't forgive, it didn't forget, and it sure as hell didn't stay buried. By midday, the team was deep into the hills north of the abandoned base. The terrain was harsh, dry gullies and ridgelines that offered too many places to hide. They moved cautiously, weapons low, senses sharp. Every sound carried, every echo felt alive. Reynolds led point. His movements were disciplined now, efficient, nothing like the cocky cadet she'd once known. Watching him, Sarah almost smiled. Almost. "Anything on thermal?" she asked through comms. "Negative," Reynolds replied. "No movement within 500 meters." They reached an old communications outpost, a concrete bunker half buried in sand. The door hung open, rusted, the interior dark and still. Sarah motioned for the team to fan out, then entered first. The air inside was stale, thick with dust. And then she saw it on the floor beside a dead terminal. A photo. 2 figures in desert gear. Her and Kane. Smiling, squinting against the Afghan sun. A memory frozen in grainy print. Her throat tightened. She knelt, picking it up carefully. The edges were burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it but couldn't bring themselves to finish. Reynolds approached from behind, his voice low. "That's you." Sarah nodded, barely audible. "This outpost was our fallback during the op. We never made it this far." He looked around. "Then how did this get here?" Before she could answer, the radio on her vest crackled again, faint at first, then clearer. That same voice, cutting through static. "You're close, Sarah, just like before." Her pulse spiked. "Kane," she whispered, "where are you?" "You'll find me when you stop following orders." Then the signal cut. Reynolds looked at her, alarmed. "Ma'am." She cut him off. "We're pulling back to camp now." That night, as the desert cooled and the stars bled into the horizon, Sarah sat alone with the photo under the flickering light of a lantern. Her thoughts were a storm, flashes of memory and guilt colliding with the present. She remembered the explosion, the shouting, the dust choking the sky. She remembered Kane dragging her behind cover, shouting orders she couldn't hear over the gunfire. She remembered the blood, his blood on her gloves. And she remembered running, carrying the intel officer to the extraction chopper, looking back only once to see the compound collapsing in fire. They told her later there were no survivors. She believed them. She had to. The flap rustled. Reynolds entered, hesitant. "You need to see this." He led her to the comms rig. Static filled the air, but beneath it, faint and rhythmic, a signal repeated every 30 seconds. Not random, patterned. She leaned closer, adjusting the dial. "That's Morse code." He nodded. "It started 20 minutes ago. I logged the pattern." He handed her the notepad. The translation made her blood run cold. C6, still alive. Coordinates 33.09 N, 67.45 E. Reynolds exhaled. "That's 20 clicks east." Sarah stared at the note. Her heart hammered in her chest. Compound 6, the same one from the Kandahar operation. The one that was supposed to be gone, buried under airstrikes, scrubbed from every record. "This can't be real," she muttered. "Unless someone rebuilt it," Reynolds said quietly. Sarah folded the note carefully, tucking it into her vest. "We move at first light." Reynolds hesitated. "With respect, ma'am, should we inform command if this is?" "This isn't a request," she said sharply. "It's a rescue." He stared at her, understanding dawning that this wasn't protocol. This was personal. "Understood," he said. The next morning they moved out under a burning sun. The team was smaller now, just her, Reynolds, and the medic. The others were left to maintain the base relay. They traveled light and fast, moving across the ridgelines toward the old coordinates. The air grew thinner, the ground harsher, the silence heavier with every mile. By noon they reached the outskirts, the ruins of what had once been Compound 6. Only it wasn't ruins anymore. The perimeter walls stood rebuilt, patched with scavenged steel. New antennae jutted from the rooftops. Smoke drifted faintly from inside. Reynolds crouched beside her, peering through binoculars. "Looks active. You think he's in there?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. Only one way to find out. They waited until dusk to move in. The desert bled gold, then red, then darkness. They approached low and silent, slipping through gaps in the wall. The air inside was thick, too still for a base that was supposedly active. Then they saw the bodies. Afghan soldiers, U.S. uniforms, some old, some fresh, all lined up neatly against the far wall, execution style. The medic swallowed hard. Jesus. Reynolds scanned the area. No hostiles in sight. Sarah's mind raced. Why leave them like this? Why broadcast a signal? Then from the shadows, a faint metallic sound, a door opening. She spun, weapon raised. A figure stepped into the light. Tall, bearded, eyes glinting beneath a worn tactical helmet. "Sarah," he said softly, "you came." It was him. David Kane. Alive. Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, the world tilted, disbelief, grief, and something dangerously close to relief colliding in her chest. "Kane, how?" He smiled faintly. "Long story, but first put the gun down. You're standing in a trap." Reynolds tensed. "Don't." Before he could finish, the floodlights snapped on. Figures emerged from every shadow, armed men, faces covered. Not Taliban, not soldiers, mercenaries. Sarah's instinct took over. She grabbed Reynolds, shoving him behind cover as bullets tore through the air. The medic went down instantly, hit in the leg but alive. Sarah fired back, precise, controlled. 2 shots, 2 down. Kane moved with impossible speed, covering her flank. "Still trust me," he shouted. She fired again, teeth gritted. "I don't know yet." They fought through the barrage, retreating toward the outer wall. The gunfire echoed into the night like thunder against stone. When it finally stopped, silence returned, deafening, unnatural. Sarah leaned against the wall, chest heaving. What the hell was that? Kane wiped blood from his arm, eyes dark. "Not everyone left Afghanistan when the flags came down. Some of us stayed, built our own war." Reynolds stared at him. "You're working with them." Kane looked at Sarah. "No, against them." He dropped a small data drive into her hand. "Everything you came looking for is on that. Who funded the mercenaries? Who turned this place into a graveyard?" Sarah stared at it. "Why contact me?" He gave a tired smile. "Because you're the only one who'd come, and because you owe me." Reynolds glanced at her, confusion, anger, and loyalty colliding. "Ma'am, what does he mean?" Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was still locked on Kane's words, "You owe me." The desert wind howled, sweeping sand over the bodies at their feet. The line between past and present had blurred completely. She looked down at the drive, its metal surface catching the faint starlight. Proof, redemption, or maybe damnation. Kane met her eyes. "You can still walk away, Sarah, but you won't." He was right. She never could. That night they camped in the ruins, the firelight low, the shadows restless. Kane sat apart, silent, staring into the flames. Reynolds tended to the medic, still shaken but stable. Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept turning the data drive in her hand, feeling the weight of it heavier than it should have been. Because it wasn't just metal, it was truth. The kind that destroyed reputations and rewrote wars. And somewhere in that truth, her name might be written too. She looked at Kane across the fire. "You said I owe you for what?" He looked up slowly. "For surviving." She exhaled, her voice soft, almost breaking. "I thought I left you for dead." "You did," he said, "but I didn't die, I adapted." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried too many ghosts. "Guess you were right, Sarah. Modern warfare isn't about brute strength, it's about adaptability." Then his smile faded, and you're about to find out who adapted better. The fire crackled between them, its light carving the space like a warning line. Sarah stared into the flames, at the man she'd once trusted, at the boy she'd once taught, and at the choice that was coming. Duty or redemption. One would save lives. The other would save her soul. But not both. What if the truth you uncover is the one that ends everything you fought to protect? The desert was cold again. Wind whispered through the ruins of Compound 6, carrying with it the smell of sand, oil, and blood. The fire from the night before had burned down to embers, glowing faintly in the dark. Sarah sat apart from the others, her back against a crumbling wall, the data drive balanced in her palm. Small, ordinary. Yet inside it, Kane had said, was everything, the truth about who armed the mercenaries, who turned soldiers into targets, who profited from their silence. She turned it over slowly. Something about its weight felt wrong, not physical but moral, like it held not information but judgment. Reynolds approached quietly, his footsteps barely disturbing the sand. "You've been staring at that thing for hours," he said softly. "You think it's legit." She didn't look up. He's not the kind to bluff. He crouched beside her. "Ma'am, I need to ask, what exactly happened between you and Kane?" She exhaled, the sound tired, like a memory she'd repeated too many times. "We were partners. My first combat rotation, Kandahar. We were sent to extract an intelligence officer who'd been captured. Everything went wrong, ambush, bad comms, chain of command in chaos. We made it to the target, but we were surrounded. He covered me while I got the officer out." Reynolds listened quietly, the firelight flickering across his face. "And they told you he didn't make it?" "Yeah," she said softly. "Only, now I know that wasn't true." He nodded slowly. "And now he's working against the same people we used to fight for." Sarah finally met his gaze. "That's what scares me, Reynolds, because maybe he's not wrong." A gust of wind cut through the camp, scattering sand over their boots. Somewhere beyond the ridges, a coyote howled, long, distant, and mournful. Sarah pocketed the drive. "Get some rest," she said quietly. "We move at dawn." He hesitated. "Move where?" "To find out who the hell we've been fighting for." Morning came pale and gray. They left the ruins behind, trekking north through the ravine toward a small airstrip that intelligence had listed as inactive. If Kane was telling the truth, that's where the supply chain ended, the hub that kept the mercenaries armed and funded. Reynolds led the way, his steps silent, controlled. He, grown into a soldier she respected, not for obedience but for integrity. She could see it now in the way he moved, not the arrogance of youth, but the quiet discipline of a man who understood weight, the kind she once had before politics replaced purpose. They reached the airstrip just after midday and found it alive. Cargo trucks, private contractors, men in mixed uniforms, no insignia. And on the runway, a transport plane, its fuselage marked not by any national flag, but by a corporate logo. Reynolds whispered, "They're using private logistics to move weapons." Sarah raised her scope. "Not just weapons. Look at the crates, classified intel, recovered tech. This isn't rogue, this is sanctioned." He frowned. "By who?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "By the people who told me Kane was dead." They watched as a man in civilian clothes stepped off the plane, shaking hands with one of the contractors. The angle was bad, but when he turned toward them, Sarah froze. It was Colonel Darnell, her mentor, her former commander, the man who had brought her here. Her breath caught. Reynolds turned toward her. "Ma'am." She lowered the scope slowly, her pulse pounding in her throat. "Pack it up. We're leaving." "But," I said, "move." They retreated into the ravine, ducking behind cover as the sound of engines roared overhead. Sarah pressed her back against the stone, trying to steady her breathing. The desert seemed to close in heat, pressing down like accusation. Reynolds finally spoke. "You knew him." She nodded faintly. "He trained me, protected me, signed my transfer after the Kandahar mission." Reynolds swallowed hard. "You think he's behind this?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I think he's been behind it the whole time." That night they set camp in a narrow pass, the stars sharp above them, the air thin. Kane sat opposite her, his rifle laid beside him, face illuminated by the small fire between them. Reynolds kept watch at the edge of camp, his silhouette outlined against the dim horizon. Sarah finally broke the silence. "You could have told me Darnell was involved." Kane looked up. "Would you have believed me?" She didn't answer. He leaned forward slightly. "He's been running private operations out here for years, using academy graduates as field test assets, training mercenary units under false designations. That base we found, Echo 12, wasn't ambushed. It was erased." Sarah's stomach turned. "Why?" "Because they found out," Kane said. "They uncovered the link between his command and the supply chain. Darnell used the blackout as cover, had them eliminated. Then he called you back, the one soldier who could make the story believable." Her eyes flashed. "You think he sent me here to clean it up?" Kane nodded. "Or die trying." The words hit like a punch. Sarah stared into the fire, her reflection fractured in the flames. "You should have stayed dead," she murmured. Kane chuckled bitterly. "You're not the first to say that." He reached into his vest and pulled out another drive, older, scratched. He tossed it to her. "Backup copy. If you're smart, you'll take it and vanish." She caught it, looking at him across the flames. "And if I'm not?" He smiled faintly. "Then you'll do what you've always done, put your life where your conscience is." By morning, they were already moving again, back toward Bagram. Sarah's mind ran in loops. Every step brought her closer to a truth she didn't want but couldn't ignore. Reynolds walked beside her, quiet but alert. She could feel his questions pressing against his silence. Finally, she said, "You don't have to follow me, Reynolds." He looked at her sharply. "With respect, ma'am, you taught me what it means to follow conviction. I'm here." She nodded once. "Then understand what that means. We're going after one of our own." His jaw tightened. "Then let's make sure we do it right." They reached the airfield perimeter by nightfall. It was busier now, trucks loading, guards patrolling. Darnell stood near the hangar, speaking into a sat phone, his voice indistinct but his posture unmistakable, confident, composed, commanding. The man she had once trusted with her life. Sarah steadied her rifle, the crosshairs hovering over his chest, not to shoot, but to remember what it felt like to have that much control. Then she lowered it. Reynolds whispered, "What's the plan?" "We get inside," she said. "Upload the drive, transmit it to command archives before he wipes it. And after that—" She glanced at him. "There is no after that." They moved under the cover of darkness, slipping through the perimeter fence, hugging the shadows of cargo crates. The hum of generators filled the air, masking their footsteps. Sarah reached the main terminal door, bypassed the keypad with practiced precision, and slipped inside. Rows of monitors flickered, logistics, manifests, encrypted files. The nerve center of Darnell's entire operation. She inserted the data drive. The screen blinked. "Decryption initiated, 38%. Then a voice behind her. "Always breaking protocol, Mitchell." She froze. Darnell stepped from the shadows, his pistol already drawn. His tone was calm, almost paternal. "You never could let go of old ghosts." Sarah turned slowly, hands raised. "You lied to me." He smiled. "No, Lieutenant, I managed you. You were too good to waste but too idealistic to trust." Reynolds appeared from the side, rifle raised. "Drop it, sir." Darnell didn't even flinch. "I taught you both better than this. You don't pull a trigger you can't live with." He turned his gaze on Sarah. "You think exposing this will change anything? You'll be erased before the report even reaches DC." Sarah's voice was low, steady. Maybe, but the truth will outlive me. He sighed, not angry, just disappointed. You really are your own worst enemy. Then he fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the hangar. Reynolds lunged forward, not at Darnell, but toward Sarah, pulling her down. The bullet tore through her sleeve, grazing her arm. She hit the ground hard, breath knocked out of her. Reynolds returned fire, one clean shot. Darnell staggered back, hit square in the chest. His pistol dropped. He collapsed against the crates, gasping, the light in his eyes fading fast. Sarah crawled to him, blood streaking her sleeve. He looked up at her, mouth twisting in a faint, bitter smile. You think you've won, he whispered. You're still part of it, we all are. Then he went still. Silence filled the hangar, broken only by the soft hum of the upload screen. Transmission complete. Reynolds lowered his weapon slowly. His hands were shaking. Ma'am. Sarah sat back, staring at Darnell's body, at the man who had shaped her career, her convictions, her blind spots. The man who'd turned the war into business and loyalty into currency. Her voice was barely audible. No one wins. They burned the evidence. The cargo, the files, the hangar, everything Darnell built turned to ash beneath the desert stars. When it was done, Sarah stood at the edge of the flames, her wounded arm bound, her expression unreadable. Reynolds joined her quietly. Command's going to come looking for him. They'll find what they always find, she said, a cover story. He studied her face, the exhaustion there, the stillness that came only after too much loss. You did the right thing. She shook her head. No, I did the necessary thing. The fire reflected in her eyes, fierce, silent, unforgiving. In the distance, the wind carried the faint echo of rotor blades, evac inbound. But Sarah didn't move. She just watched the blaze consume everything they once believed in. Reynolds spoke softly, "What now?" Sarah's answer came like a whisper, meant more for herself than for him. Now we learn to live with what's left. She looked down at her bandaged arm, then at the horizon, the endless, haunted horizon of a country that never truly let go of anyone. Because in war, victory isn't survival. It's remembering what you didn't destroy to get there. How do you explain the truth when no one wants to hear it? The first thing Sarah remembered was the smell of disinfectant, sterile, sharp, and familiar. The kind that lived in every military hospital she'd ever been in. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the white light above her. Her arm was bandaged, her ribs sore. For a brief, blissful moment, she didn't remember why. Then the memory came flooding back, the gunfire, Darnell's face, the flames rising behind him, and the silence that followed. She turned her head. Reynolds was in the chair beside her bed, head bowed, his uniform dirty and torn. He hadn't shaved in days. When he saw her move, he stood immediately. "Ma'am," he said, voice hoarse, "you're awake." Sarah tried to sit up but winced. "How long?" 48 hours. We got pulled out by a medevac team. Command's been asking questions. Her eyes narrowed. Questions. He hesitated. About Darnell, about the fire, about the transmission. Sarah exhaled slowly. Of course they are. She looked out the small window beside her bed. Beyond it, the world was gray, Kabul's skyline half hidden by dust and haze. Somewhere out there, she knew, the machine was already turning. Reports being rewritten, files being sealed, stories being buried. Reynolds stepped closer. They're calling it an operational accident, ammo stockpile detonation. They've already drafted a statement. Sarah almost laughed. They'll make him a hero. He didn't reply. He didn't have to. They both knew how the system worked. Truth was just another weapon, used only when convenient. "Did they ask about me?" she asked quietly. "They're debriefing you at 900. JAG officers from DC flew in last night. They want to hear your version before they decide how to classify the incident." Sarah's lips thinned. Classify, that's a nice word for Barry. Reynolds looked down, guilt flickering across his face. I told them everything I could, that you acted in self-defense, that Darnell fired first. And the transmission. I said the data was corrupted in the fire. She looked at him sharply. You lied. He met her gaze, unflinching. I protected you. Sarah's voice softened. Reynolds. He shook his head. You once told me leadership isn't about punishment, it's about transformation. You've transformed enough people already. Time someone protected you. The words hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Then she leaned back, closing her eyes. Thank you, she said softly. But truth always finds a way out, even buried truth. The interrogation room was small. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a recorder. Sarah sat straight-backed, hands folded, expression calm. Across from her sat a pair of officers in crisp suits, one gray-haired, one younger, both with eyes that missed nothing. The older one, Commander Whitlock, spoke first. Lieutenant Mitchell, he said evenly, we've reviewed the official report. However, there are inconsistencies we'd like to clarify. Understood, sir. Colonel Darnell's death, he said, consulting the folder before him, occurred during an apparent sabotage event at an unauthorized airfield. You and your team were present. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And you claim he fired first? Yes. Whitlock's brow furrowed slightly. The bodycam footage cuts off 10 seconds before the fatal shot. Convenient. Sarah didn't blink. We were under heavy fire, systems malfunction. Of course, he said dryly. He closed the folder. Lieutenant, let's speak plainly. Colonel Darnell was a decorated officer, a veteran of multiple campaigns. You, on the other hand, have a history of unorthodox decisions. The younger officer leaned forward. You've disobeyed orders before, taken liberties in the field. It's part of your record. Sarah's eyes remained calm, and it's part of why I'm still alive. Whitlock regarded her carefully. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that your account is true, that Darnell was involved in covert operations outside of protocol. Do you have evidence? Her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table. Not anymore. The data was destroyed in the explosion. Then we have a problem, he said, closing the file. Without proof, we can't corroborate your story, and that leaves us with 2 options. Either Colonel Darnell betrayed his oath, he paused, his tone shifting, or you executed a superior officer. Silence. Sarah didn't move, didn't breathe. Then she said quietly, I did what had to be done. The older man studied her. You understand that's not an answer. It's the only one that's true. Whitlock sighed, leaning back. You've built quite the reputation, Lieutenant. Decorated, respected, trusted. Don't throw it away over ghosts. She met his gaze. Some ghosts deserve the truth. He closed the file. You'll remain on restricted duty until further notice. We'll contact you after the review board convenes. Sarah nodded once, understood. As she stood to leave, the younger officer spoke almost as an afterthought. Lieutenant, just one more question. She turned slightly, sir. He regarded her carefully. Do you regret it? For a long moment she said nothing. Then, regret and honor are the same thing, sir. You only earn one if you've risked the other. And then she walked out. Outside the compound, the air was cooler, evening settling over cobble in shades of gold and dust. Reynolds waited near the transport truck, hands in his pockets. When he saw her, he straightened. How bad? He asked. Officially, I'm under review. Unofficially, I'm radioactive. He nodded slowly. Figures. She studied him for a moment. You could still walk away from this, Reynolds. Tell them you followed orders. Say you didn't know. I won't, he said firmly. I made my choice. She gave a small nod of respect. Then you've learned the hardest lesson of all. He raised an eyebrow. Which is? She looked out toward the mountains. That the truth costs everyone, not just the guilty. Days passed, then weeks. The investigation stretched on, quiet and invisible, a storm she couldn't see but could feel in her bones. Her days became routine. Check-ins, silence, training reports. The world kept turning, but slower now, as if waiting for a verdict that might never come. Sometimes, late at night, she'd find herself back on the training field in her mind, the one in Maryland where it had all started. She'd see Reynolds as a cadet again, gun trembling in his hand, arrogance masking fear. And she'd see herself calm, unflinching, certain. That certainty was gone now. Not because she doubted what she'd done, but because she'd realized how fragile righteousness really was, how easily the line blurred between justice and survival. 3 months later, the verdict came, one sentence, sealed and signed. No further action. Case closed. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell honorably discharged by request. No explanation, no recognition, just a quiet exit from a life that had defined her for decades. Reynolds was waiting outside the debrief office when she stepped out. He looked older now, older than his years. "It's over," he asked. She handed him the paper. "On paper, yes." He read it, then looked up. "They made you resign." "They made me a choice," she said softly. "Stay silent or stay whole." "And you chose silence." "No," she said, "I chose peace." He shook his head. "You really think there's peace after something like this?" She smiled faintly. "Not peace, just quiet." A week later, she boarded a flight out of Kabul. No ceremony, no salute, just a duffel bag and a silence that weighed more than armor. The desert faded beneath the wings, the mountains shrinking into memory. Somewhere over the Indian Ocean, she looked out the window and saw her reflection, the faint outline of a soldier who had become something else. Not broken, not lost, just done. She thought about the people she'd met, Tangastal, Kane, Darnell, Reynolds. Each one a different kind of mirror, each showing her a version of herself she had to face. And somewhere in that reflection, she found a truth she'd spent years avoiding. You don't survive war, you just carry it better. When the plane landed in D.C., the air felt too clean, too calm. She walked down the jet bridge with her duffel slung over her shoulder, blending into the crowd of civilians. No medals, no applause, no uniform. Just another traveler coming home. Outside the terminal, the city lights flickered against the night sky, distant, indifferent. She took a long breath, then reached into her bag and pulled out the smaller data drive Kane had given her, the backup, the one she hadn't told anyone about. For a long moment, she just stared at it, the weight of everything it represented pressing against her palm. She could turn it in, she could end the story. Or she could walk away, let the truth fade like all the others before it. Then she heard Kane's voice again, faint in memory. "You'll do what you've always done, put your life where your conscience is." She smiled sadly. Not this time. She dropped the drive into a trash bin. The clatter was small, almost nothing, but to her it sounded like an ending. That night Sarah sat by the Potomac, watching the river move beneath the stars. The city hummed around her, traffic, distant sirens, life continuing without notice. She breathed in the cool air, the scent of rain and steel. Her phone buzzed, a message. From Reynolds. "Heading back to Maryland next week. They offered me instructor position. Thought you'd want to know." She smiled faintly, full circle. She typed back. "Teach them well, Reynolds. Remind them that control isn't power, it's purpose." His reply came seconds later. "You already did." She looked out over the water, her reflection shimmering in the dark current. The war was over for her at least, but the lessons would remain. In Reynolds, in the cadets who came after, in the quiet places where courage didn't shout. And maybe that was enough. Because sometimes, the most honorable thing a soldier can do isn't fight. It's stop fighting. As she rose to leave, She whispered the words she had lived by, soft, steady, final. Dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. The wind carried them away, lost to the night. But somewhere in the silence they stayed. When a soldier stops fighting, who do they become? Years passed quietly. The world moved on as it always does. Wars ended, others began. Flags changed, names were forgotten, new cadets filled old barracks. And somewhere far from the noise, Sarah Mitchell learned how to breathe again. The ocean had always been her sanctuary. The small coastal town she settled in barely showed up on maps, a place of weathered docks, white gulls, and mornings that smelled like salt and silence. Her house overlooked the water, a modest structure with peeling paint and a porch that creaked when the wind shifted. She liked it that way. Things that creaked, she thought, had stories. She woke early every day, old habits never died. Coffee first, then a walk along the shoreline where waves broke soft and steady, the horizon stretching endlessly, like the sky she once flew under during recon missions. Some mornings, she still caught herself scanning it, watching for movement, for threat, for ghosts. But mostly, it was peace now. Inside the house, the walls were bare except for one framed letter. Reynolds's letter. You could have ended my career when I pointed that gun at your head. Instead, you showed me what it truly means to be a warrior. Some save lives by taking others. You save lives by transforming them. She'd read it hundreds of times, but never out loud. It wasn't a reminder of pride, it was one of accountability. Proof that something good could come from all that pain if you stayed long enough to teach someone how not to repeat it. The world called her retired. She called herself unfinished. One gray morning, as the fog rolled in from the sea, her old phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it, then answered. Lieutenant Mitchell. The voice was familiar, older now, steadier, but still carrying that respectful edge. She smiled faintly. It's Sarah now, Reynolds. A quiet laugh. You still answer like an officer. Force of habit. How are you, Ensign? Commander, he corrected softly. She blinked. Commander, huh, that was fast. Fast is relative, he said. It's been 6 years. She leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the fog swallowing the shore. Has it? It has, he said. And I've got news. The Academy expanded the Mitchell program. She frowned slightly. The what? They renamed the close quarters leadership curriculum you designed. It's mandatory now, the Mitchell training doctrine. Real emphasis on restraint, control, adaptability. They even quote your lectures. She laughed quietly, shaking her head. Never thought I'd become a doctrine. Well, you did, he said, and I thought you should know your lesson stuck. Something in his voice softened then. You remember what you told me once. That control starts with humility. I remember. He hesitated. We've been teaching it to cadets for years now. You changed the way they see leadership, ma'am, the way I see it. Sarah smiled faintly. That's all I ever wanted. Actually, he said, clearing his throat, that's not why I called. Oh. I'm organizing a ceremony at Annapolis. For the new graduates, we're dedicating the training yard, the same one where everything started. He paused, his tone shifting, almost hesitant. We want you there. The cadets deserve to meet the person who taught us what strength really means. She didn't speak for a long moment. The sound of waves filled the silence between them. Finally, she said, Reynolds, I don't belong on that field anymore. With respect, ma'am, that's exactly why you do. She exhaled softly. Let me think about it. He smiled through the line. You've been thinking long enough. Let yourself be seen again. The call ended, leaving her alone with the sound of the tide, steady, rhythmic, patient. She looked again at the framed letter on the wall. Then, at the duffel in her closet she hadn't opened in years, the one with the uniform folded neatly inside, and the trident she'd almost thrown away. 3 weeks later, The train pulled into Annapolis Station under a cloudless blue sky. Sarah stepped onto the platform, the hum of the city greeting her like an old song she'd forgotten the lyrics to. The academy grounds looked almost the same, new faces, same discipline. Flags snapped in the wind, voices carried across the yard. But as she walked the familiar path toward the training field, something inside her ached not from regret but from recognition. Every step brought back flashes: laughter, defiance, confrontation, silence, respect. Ghosts but peaceful ones. Reynolds was waiting near the bleachers. He looked different now, older, confident, wearing the insignia of command. His posture was still perfect, but there was warmth behind it now. When he saw her, his face broke into a smile. "I almost didn't believe you'd come," he said. She smiled back. "I almost didn't." He extended a hand, but she pulled him into a brief, firm hug instead. "You've done well, Commander." "You taught me how," he said simply. They stood for a moment, watching the cadets assemble on the field. Young men and women in perfect formation, eyes bright, energy high. Reynolds nodded toward them. "They've been told who you are. They think you're some kind of legend." She chuckled. "That just means they haven't met me yet." "Then let's fix that." The ceremony was simple. No pomp, no spectacle, just purpose. Reynolds spoke first, standing before the gathered cadets, his voice steady through the microphone. "Years ago," he began, "I met an instructor who taught me something no manual ever could, that real strength isn't about power or victory. It's about control, about knowing when not to pull the trigger." The cadets stood in rapt silence. "She showed us that leadership isn't about commanding obedience. It's about earning trust. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is restraint." He turned then, gesturing toward Sarah. "Please welcome the woman who taught me, and countless others, what it truly means to serve." Applause broke out, loud, sincere, rising like a wave. Sarah stood still for a moment, letting the sound wash over her, not as validation, but as release. When she finally stepped forward, the noise quieted. She looked out over the sea of uniforms, faces so young, so full of untested belief. She saw herself in them, before the scars, before the doubts. She spoke softly, but her voice carried. "I used to think being a soldier was about winning," she said. "About proving you were stronger, faster, harder than anyone else." She paused, scanning their faces. "But war taught me something else. It taught me that strength isn't what you show when people are watching. It's what you hold onto when no one is." The wind stirred the flags behind her. The field was silent. "You'll face moments that test you, not in battle but in conscience. Times when the easy choice will feel right and the right choice will feel impossible. When that happens, remember this: courage isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the moment you choose integrity over comfort, humanity over victory." Her gaze found Reynolds briefly, a silent acknowledgement. Then she added, "And when people underestimate you, let them. Because the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who don't need to prove themselves, they're the ones who make history without ever asking for it." There was silence. Then slowly applause again, not the loud kind this time, but the heartfelt kind that carried meaning. Reynolds joined her on stage, whispering, "Still the best speech I've ever heard." She smiled. "Still not a speech, just truth." Later that evening, after the crowd had gone and the field stood empty, Sarah lingered at the edge of the training yard. The sun dipped low, painting the grass in amber light. The air smelled of salt and memory. Reynolds approached quietly, holding a small plaque. He handed it to her. "Dedicated to Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, whose silence taught us more than words ever could." She ran her fingers over the engraving, her throat tightening. "You didn't have to do this." "We did," he said simply. "You gave us a legacy." She looked at him, smiling faintly. "Keep it honest." He nodded. "Always." They stood in silence for a while, mentor and student, both changed, both whole in their own broken ways. Then Reynolds said softly, "You know, they still tell stories about that day on the field. 4 cadets, 1 Navy SEAL." She chuckled. "Let them. Maybe it'll keep the next idiot from pointing a gun at an instructor." He laughed, "Or at least make them think twice." That night she walked the grounds one last time, the sound of her boots echoing against the pavement. The academy lights glowed behind her, but the stars ahead burned brighter. She paused at the gate, taking one final look at the field. The place where she'd once stood alone, underestimated, doubted, and where everything had begun. And for the first time in years, she whispered it, not as a memory but as peace. "You never threaten a Navy SEAL." Then she smiled, "But you can learn from one." She turned toward the road, the wind catching her hair, the night wrapping around her like an old friend. She didn't look back. Because she didn't have to. The field would remember her. The cadets would carry her lessons. And somewhere deep inside, so would she. Moral: sometimes victory isn't loud. It isn't medals or rank or applause. Sometimes victory is walking away knowing you left something better behind. A truth that lives on in others. A dignity that doesn't speak. It simply acts.